Hello, everyone, and welcome to our event tonight. My name is David Barrick, and I am here for Poetry London. Tonight we have the great pleasure of listening to the poetry of David Ly and Amy LeBlanc. This event is co-sponsored by Poetry London and Words Fest. And I'd like to quickly acknowledge our sponsors, the Canada Council for the Arts, the Ontario Arts Council, and the London Arts Council, who have made this event possible tonight. I know that we have viewers tuning in from all over the country tonight, so I think it's really important to acknowledge that we are all on the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples. Poetry London and Words Fest operate on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenape, and the Attawandaron peoples. We encourage you to learn more about the land that you're on and to look into practical, concrete ways of supporting your regional Indigenous artists and organizations working towards truth and reconciliation and addressing the ongoing injustices that Indigenous people experience every day. So again, it's my great pleasure to introduce David and Amy. I'll get to their bios in just a moment. As the reading is happening, as we hear the wonderful poems that are ahead, please feel free to drop questions into the chat at the bottom of your screen. After the reading, Amy and David will be fielding questions. There'll be a question and answer period. So please feel free to ask ask questions as you're listening to the poetry. Also, there are two books, Mythical Man by David Ly and I Know Something You Don't Know by Amy LeBlanc, are available for purchase from the publisher's websites. And those purchase links will be dropped into the chat as well. So definitely check out these excellent books of poetry. Okay, so I'm going to introduce our poets. David Ly is author of Mythical Man, which was shortlisted for the 2021 Relit Poetry Award. His sophomore poetry collection, Dream of Me as Water, is forthcoming in 2022. David is the poetry editor at This Magazine, part of the Anstruther Press editorial collective, and a poetry manuscript consultant with the Writers Studio at SFU. I'm going to introduce both of our poets and then let them take things away. Amy LeBlanc is managing editor at Filling Station magazine in Calgary. She is a recipient of the 2020 Lieutenant Governor of Alberta Emerging Artist Award, and her debut poetry collection, I Know Something You Don't Know, was published with Gordon Hill Press in 2020 and was longlisted for the 2021 Relit Award. Her novella, Unlocking, was published by the University of Calgary Press in 2021, and her work has appeared in many journals across the nation. Amy is author of 3 chapbooks, including Undead Juliet at the Museum, which is forthcoming with Zed Press in 2021. David and Amy, it's a pleasure to have you here. I'm so excited to hear your poetry.
Thanks for having us. I'm really excited.
Thank you so much for having us.
Okay, Amy, where do you want to start?
Do you want to start with one of yours, and I'll kind of bounce off?
Sure.
Whatever you're cool.
Sure. Okay, so I'll start with a poem, aptly kind of titled, starting things off with "Waking at the Beginning of the World." Waking at the beginning of the world. I guess I didn't let go when the time before came to an end. With a single pull, you burst from rock, eras projecting in all directions. One sliced my chin, another grazed our hands as they unclasped. Burgundy eyelashes, a smile, and you grabbed my wrist, bolted for dunes that rolled on and on. I swear every step made the desert seem more vast. There, a serpent stalked us as it burst from the sand, its bulbous black head staring us down, flicking its leathery tongue, opening its mouth and inviting us inside. With your free hand, You calmly stroked one of its fangs. I shuddered when it simultaneously snapped its jaws shut, dove back into the sand, shifting sparkling grains on the surface as it swerved beneath. You let go of me, broke into a chase after it. I followed, and now we run towards the beasts. Thank you. I'll pass it over to
David.
Now. Thank you.
Just listening to your poem, when it's really funny because your first poem and my first poem speak together quite well. Mine's pretty short, but one of the really strong words that spoke out for me in your poem was fangs. And this poem has some biting as well. So this poem is called Birthing Black Rabbits. And it's a weird short little poem about a woman named Mary Toft, who lived in Ireland a very long time ago and had this whole scam where she tricked people into thinking she was giving birth to rabbits. And she scammed a bunch of people out of their money. And I think she's just this really incredibly fascinating figure. So this is called Birthing Black Rabbits. At the foot of the bed, she gripped wet sheets as rabbit feet sprung out from between her legs. Each was taken as a sample, sinuous lungs kept in a jar, suckling mouths turned toward their mother. She reached to them and placed their ears between her lips, her kits a monstrous birth. Reaching for a kit, the doctor gripped a sopping tail. She dropped into dreamless sleep. He retched, the mother bit his hand.
Ooh. That lady, she knew what she was doing. That's awesome. So this next poem is called Mythical Man 2. So in the book, there are 4 parts in it. Each has a poem in it called Mythical Man. And this is the one in the second part. Mythical Man 2. We press against each other so hard that I should just admit I want to be absorbed into you. Our atoms amalgamating until we become a hydra, writhing with 100 hissing heads poised to strike. But the harder I try to inhabit this idea, the more I know of its futility. Eventually, each head will be sliced off, tar black blood kissing the hilt of my sword. I'll need to cauterize each wound to prevent our dreams from regrowing, distractions from the real magic that makes us powerful on our own.
Amazing. So to take it in a different direction, the poem that I'm going to read next, this one's not about rabbits. It's called The Storied Life of Grace Poole. I don't want to say a mythical figure. I can't compare it with David's Mythical Man, but it's a very kind of minor character in Jane Eyre, which has always been and will always be one of my favorite novels. So this is kind of a reimagining of what that character's life might have been like. She dangled striated scarves from the window, rattling her head as I held her waist. He told me to keep her quiet, to keep her safe, compliant, the significant paranoia that she might be vaulting, purging, dancing like red fiber from rafters. She tells me my hair reminds her of a fox. My brush is a signal to enemy lines, her lips parting on a stolen glass of honey-soaked wine. She and I watch the tree as it splits and succumbs in the orchard, a split where the tree was licked with a voltage-charged tongue. She says that it will never be the same again. We are both behind the lock and chain, but I can abscond to the halls and gates. She lingers behind the latch, her fingers entwined in a lock of my red hair. We are curious bedfellows with sweetness on our thighs, the topographical curving of bones and banks. She is hers and I am mine. I will never ask for more than the chill of her hands that cool me until I drown. She won't jump with someone to hush the light.
Oh, I like that one. I'm changing up my third poem after hearing you say that poem had to do with Jane Eyre. So I had to quickly find the poem. I've never seen Jane Eyre. The movie's just way too long for me and I can't sit through it. But I know that Michael Fassbender plays somebody in Jane Eyre. So I'm going to read my celebrity sighting poem. Wednesday means I can look at the day with optimism or pessimism. Not all love songs in my earbuds have to be about you. I don't need to think about how today's air feels humid and still, like the first night we caught eyes on the SkyTrain. This cart is empty, save for a man sitting across from me who looks like a mid-20s Michael Fassbender and a little bit like you, if I'm being honest. I have a thing for men with sunken cheeks, an air of unpredictability in their eyes. He's wearing wireless retro big, rose gold headphones, tapping his foot to a rhythm I'm trying to tap into but can't follow. It's Wednesday, so it's been 2 or 3 weeks since we last texted. I hope memories of me haunt you through love songs that you forgot you had on your phone. Fassbender's lookalike slips off his cans, tilts his head up, and our eyes meet for a beat before he moves to the window to see if we've reached Granville Station, the place where you and I parted, and I endured the long 30 minutes back to my bed. Today, when the SkyTrain enters and leaves the station, Fassbender still on board, I click on a song that doesn't remind me of you.
Love Michael Fassbender lookalikes. The best kind of like. This next poem that I'm going to read is called Flannery. And I've never seen a Flannery O'Connor lookalike, but I would be really happy if I did because I'd love to meet her. But this is a poem which is kind of talking back to one of my favorite short stories by Flannery O'Connor, which is A Good Man is Hard to Find, which is super anthologized, but if you haven't read it, it's absolutely incredible. It kind of makes my stomach drop. It's one of the best things I've ever read. This poem is called Flannery. The chronicity of her temper could curl hair and color it silver white. She didn't want to go to Florida, but the valise was prepared and could not be unpacked. The shirts were tucked and folded in fours, carried over the hill until they ached and the tissues tore in the shape of a butterfly. She carried them to the side of the grove with tarragon, daisies, and lace. They were told to keep quiet, to approach the car and stay put. She sucked on an olive pit that scraped her teeth until they were uprooted. She knew the advice they were given was not sound, but they stayed long enough for grass to grow over their heads.
That's a sweet one. So my next poem, it's written after Kai Cheng Thom's poem called Peat Moss Man. So the idea of Mythical Man in this whole book is that the poems explore ideas of manhood and masculinity. I kind of took this poem as an opportunity just kind of like, well, instead of exploring the ideas and facets of masculinity and manhood, I just decided to make a man myself. And this poem came into being. It's called Wild Spell. A man made from parts of the dead, bones blessed with viper venom, a rib cage that won't crack as he expands to swallow the entire world. A man dressed in cuttlefish chromatophores for when he wants to hide, wants others to see him, for when he only wants to be seen by me. Gastropod shells are ground down to a fine powder and dusted over his pink lips. He won't be able to help but to slowly kiss incantations along my neck. Soon, his nectar bat tongue slips from my body's sweetest parts, his hands sporting talons to clutch someone else who can better love the wildness that wished him into existence.
I did what you did before, and I'm switching up my next poem in response to that one. I love the magical vibes and just that really sensual kind of magic. So this next poem is called Night Apparition. In a filigree nightgown, she stands at the edge of the water, carrying a blood flower and lady's lace as moths nip her collar. The horses drink poisoned water with floating sides and floating specks in their eyes. She slits her lip, shifts her insides until she tastes blood. In her limp grip, the plants in her palms swell with newfangled buds. Her rib bones are lined with nectar, and fastened with an ivory button. She has already learned that the instrument of poison is a hollow stomach, that milk and cured petals can hasten the spoiling along.
Ooh, I love this magical route we're taking. This is fun. So, I'm going to switch up my poem again, just going off of that one, to kind of this other poem that's kind of like, your poem was kind of, it gave me this kind of really eerie feeling to it. Almost like kind of like a low horror poem almost kind of. So this next poem I'm going to read, I think it's, for me, I'm surprised we actually included it in the collection, because it's the one poem in the book that kind of scares me, just because it's kind of dark, I think. And it's another poem in my next coming book that's also even darker. And I think Jim Matter, he just likes putting one or two of those in a book at a time. So this one is called Hunt. Have you noticed how sharp and sparkly your talons are in the starlight? Let me lick them clean once you finish stirring up my sweetest and most tender parts. Pupils dilated, I see hunters who've been stalking this forest for you the moment you entered to seek me out. Clutch me in the dark. Together we'll stay silent as I brush the vertebrae protruding from your charcoal-flecked skin.
I love that. I'm glad it was included in the book. The next poem that I'm going to read, kind of continuing on with this quasi kind of horror poem theme, is the title poem of my next chapbook, Undead Juliet at the museum. And this poem came about from this really kind of horrifying Twitter thread that I absolutely love. It was towards the beginning of COVID, and it was museum curators that were sharing some of the most horrifying things they had in their collections. And the results did not disappoint. If you want nightmares, totally go check it out. So there were just such weird things in there that I felt like I had to just like work some of these into a poem and kind of come up with some of my own as well. So this is Undead Juliet at the museum. Juliet wipes fingerprints from the glass case. Inside, she finds a lamb's heart with rusted nails in the aorta, a pin cushion that looks like your ex-lover, a wreath of brown hair on an ivory plate, a set of salmon teeth. The skin between her fingers tugs, and above her head, a magpie nest rests in the rafters. The mother dives at museum guests, but not at Juliet. Her father used to say things belong in a museum when they are dead. But Juliet is undead. Her fingers might be blue and her eyes need daily reinflation, but the glass cases must be cleaned. Fingerprints leave behind too much information, especially on the inside of the glass cases. The mother magpie refutes the platitude. Juliet is undead. Magpies are spectral. And a museum is a cannonade of dust and cinder and hair.
You have to put the link to that museum Twitter thread in the chat because I want to see it. This next poem, I'm gonna take it down a notch and take the creepiness down a little bit. So this one's called Nymphaceae. And it's the name of the genus that which all lily flowers belong to. I solely kind of named the poem just because I like the way the word looked. So it goes to this. I should have believed more as a boy. If I were to pass myself now in a dream, I wouldn't feel guilty for moments of self-compassion. They bloom in the imagination like pink lilies bobbing on a boiling black lake. I tell myself that I'm just a bud of tangled magic, a page from a childhood grimoire crumpled and thrown into a fire because I couldn't find the spell I was looking for fast enough. Boy, magic exists. Count 1, 2, 3. Welcome the tingling underneath your skin and sit with how uncomfortable it can become.
Thank you. The next poem that I'm going to read is called Daedalus. The wooden box you build is not big enough to hold both bodies. A labyrinthine machine, plank after plank after plank of plywood. The copse used to hide an animal, the ligneous body of the bull pressed against your wife's waist. What if you'd had daughters? One might have fashioned wings from muslin. The other could have pulled arrows from flesh with her teeth. They would be synchronous. As it is, you nail a box shut, a slapdash coffin where the nails rust and cannot be removed once they are in place. A corpse, a catastrophe contained within four walls.
Oh, that's a good ending on that. I like that. I'm going to go to some new poetry. I just decided on the ball right now. This next poem just got published in a new magazine called Wrongdoing Mag. So this was in their first issue, and it's called What He Saw. Almost every night, he'd insist we stargaze. Overlooking the forest, I'd stare as he tilted his head toward the sky, muttering about beauty even when it was cloudy. I always tried to see what he saw, but never did until one night, a meteor broke through the clouds. He hardly reacted when I yelled for us to leave. Running back down the cliff, he veered off and I couldn't keep up. I kept looking for him until the sun came up. Orchids of all colors had taken root on the tree branches, even though they'd never been seen in the area before. I followed and they became denser until I stood in the crater where the meteorite landed. He was sitting up against it, hands in his lap, head looking down. I slid to my knees to cradle him and his body fell limp into my chest. Caressing his face, beautiful, alien-like petals bloomed from his eyes that were half closed.
Wow, I absolutely love those kind of foresty, kind of greenery kind of vibes in that poem. So I'm also switching gears from what I planned. I'm going to read a slightly longer poem. It's called Girls Reading in Red Coats. And it's a poem, it's kind of two-pronged. It's written for Shirley Jackson, who I love dearly, and for Paula Jean Weldon, who's a young woman who disappeared from her Vermont University campus in the 1940s and became the inspiration for Shirley Jackson's novel, Hang the Man, which everybody should read if you haven't already. So this is Girls Reading in Red Coats. She tucked a book into the folds of her red coat when she left her room. She felt the spine against her ribs and the edges of paper wrapping around her skin, a pair of legs in a clawfoot tub, a little berth with a belly full of rocks. The book would last her the better part of 3 days. She buttoned a scarf to her throat and picked bloodroot and 8 carrots, 9 almonds a day with a glass of water. She expected to wander and to find an altar in the trees, in the wasps, in moist roots, and the mud that caught her heels. She freed insects from jars that never held water and heard a rattling sound in her bone marrow, in her ears, eyes, hands, and teeth. They searched and searched, but she stayed hidden at her altar, or the meeting point of her own sternum and her spine. She read her book in her red buttoned coat. She thought about ivy and garden walls, moths that bleed cyanide, women in turtlenecks, wine and cake and uncomfortable pantyhose. Her coat, red as pomegranate seeds, trailed behind her, moist and well-watered. Her exposed belly could cut open letters, and bloodroot was the bedrock of her spine. Her book had moistened in the rain, so she made a herbarium and slept in the vines. Stripping the moths of their poison, she dripped them over a porringer and encouraged them to dry. When her fingernails rooted to the paper, she swallowed herself whole.
All right. Okay, I think we'll stay in the forest and I'll read this new poem here. Just give me a second. Okay, so this one's called Lucifer Flowers. Sneaking up on the past from behind, I grab the silver ram horns curling from its head and yank until I hear a scream, boyish and afraid, louder as I kick the back of its knees and it buckles into the mud, voice drowning, its 3-fingered claws scratching at my eyes, eventually surrendering. trembling on all fours and whimpering until I tighten my grip and twist and snap time's neck, its body limply smacking the mud, lucifer flowers beginning to wilt around us.
Awesome. I'm going to move us from the forest to a field. So this poem is called A Ghost in a Field Where No One Goes. And it's mostly about scarecrows and all kinds of fall imagery, because fall is my favorite season. It's a spooky season. So this is just a poem that I wrote pretty much about a scarecrow. That's all. We take the scarecrow from his perch, plaid jacket and a Geiger counter as a boutonniere. I smell pine and isopropyl alcohol with the jacket in my hands, fiber between my fingers, bits of straw float up my nose. He was posed against two poles, a lopsided crucifix, a ghost in a field where no one goes. His eyes buttoned, his mouth twined. We grab him from behind and feel dried grass in the body cavity, a nail driven through the sole of the foot for drainage in rainy seasons, mud through a rubber boot. I unbutton the shirt like I might unbutton my lover's shirt, and in my hands I hold a heart made of red cedar. A moth sleeps in a carved aorta, and larvae eat at the bark.
I like this little adventure that we're taking each other on through the forest and then the meadow. And I think I'm gonna take us to the lake now for a little nighttime swim. So this one's called Memory of the Black Lake. It was published in Art Poetry last year, and it's appearing in Biblioace's Best Canadian Poetry this fall. Memory of the Black Lake. I remember it clearly because it was cloudy the night after a choir of mermaids spawned. The surface sparkled with their bioluminescent egg sacs like a sheet of glass reflecting a night sky speckled with blue and yellow stars. You sat across from me in the rowboat, dipping the oars, breaking the still water. I tightened my hand around your knee, reminding you to be mindful of the fragile heartbeats. But you already understood to gingerly guide us, so nothing would be in danger as we crossed the Black Lake in silence.
This is so fun, because I'm going to take us in a slightly different direction with a poem that's called Fish. So this kind of bounces off the lake. And Fish is a poem written for Lavinia Fisher, who is reported to be the first female serial killer in the United States. It's a really wild story. And the thing for me that's most fun is it's entirely possible that none of it is true. It's really difficult to verify any of the facts, and a lot of people have been trying. But even that in itself as a story has such an interesting hook that I wanted to write a poem for her. So this is called Fish. Lavinia Fisher slept at a potter's field near the jail, where she poured cups of tea over poisoned sugar cubes, hung her wedding dress over the back of an oak door. She told me to call her Fish. There was no room in the house, but Fish invited me in for tea, so the suit on my body looked like I'd drowned, but she would revive me. Fish breathed in pearls and spat out buttons, draped iridescent oyster broth across her chest, lined gills with baubles. She bathed me in bourbon. It is possible that I assemble her body with wired hangers, or wallpaper paste, or pulp, or spiced salmon guts. When Fish looks at me, I forget the missing men 6 miles out, or 6 feet down, where no one will hear a bubble burst. I see a wedding dress, hanging and waltzing in a gulp of her breath.
That actually kind of works out. I don't know how long we're going to go for, but I like this train that we're on, and thank you for bringing us to Fish, because I think my next poem will be eels. All right, so eels. I get out of bed and cough up eels into bathroom sink. Baby eels squirm from bloodshot eyes. I see eels when showering, writhing from water that falls off my body. Eels are caught in the cotton while toweling off. Eels are stirred into tea as I sip, and my tongue is an eel. Eels squirm down my throat. The only imagery I have are eels, just words that are eels. Maybe eels can be everything except poems, but I keep smashing eels into the keyboard to get them out of my mind, but I still feel them eeling through the grooves of my brain like yesterday, because yesterday was an eel, like how the dream last night was a moray eel biting my hand and pulling me in with his second set of jaws. So now I'm weaving eels into a poem, hoping it's more poetry than eel.
I love that one. I think that's one of my favorites of yours, largely because I find eels just profoundly creepy. So I'm going to switch to something else a little creepy, moving slightly away from the water critter kind of direction. This is a poem called A Small Painting of a Single Eye, and it's based on a really fascinating practice that I discovered in Victorian times, where people had eye jewelry. So you would have, if you were in a relationship with somebody or like a courtship or something, you might give them a piece of jewelry that had a painting of your actual eyeball on it. And part of it was supposed to be affectionate, and the other part is that it's like, I'm always watching you. And I just thought this was so fascinating. So this piece is called A Small Painting of a Single Eye. When we began, I gave you strands of my hair, glutted with dandruff and mildew and tied with twine. You let them unravel in your coat pocket. You check the time and are reminded of me, the fur and the crown, bow and latch release, dial up, dial down. Now I give you a small painting of a single eye, a likeness of my arch, framing lashes and rose gold, a pearl for you to wear in a locket on a chain around your neck, like braided thread, a little death, a mourning cloak. Wear my eye on your body like a pallbearer. When I am gone, consult a manual to mourn me correctly.
That is so weird, eye jewelry. Okay, I think I'll end with my last poem. Requested by our host, David Barrick. This poem is going to be in my next book, coming out next fall, Dream of Me as Water. So this poem is called, it's titled after the 2014 film Godzilla. So Godzilla 2014. He brings a tsunami as he swims, shark-like, shaking theater walls with a roar that takes me back to childhood, mimicking the king of the monsters as he stomped Ghidorah's golden three necks. Now he rises from the water, crashing through Golden Gate Bridge, missiles exploding, fire engulfing gills that were redesigned to have his existence be more logical in our universe, to help him breathe underwater. Godzilla, form altered, when nobody had to change you. You would have always been understood, even when the nuances of how you exist were your own.
Amazing. I think I'll read my last poem as well. And this is a poem that hasn't, I only wrote it a couple of weeks ago. I'm still working it. I've had the pleasure of taking a poetry class with Brandon Wint for the last couple of weeks. And it's been great to just kind of get ideas flowing. So this last poem that I'll read is called Fulmination. When the cicadas went to sleep, I was 9 and afraid of widowmaker spiders, even though I had never seen one up close, only in books with crumbs buried in their spines. My skin was unmarked except for birthmarks, and I watched as my mother stood at the edge of the yard in a storm. She remained alpine, snow-capped, until she felt a lightning strike traverse her skin through the shoulder and nestle inside her body. I didn't see contact, I saw a shiver, a twitch of the left leg, skin stretching over earth tones and the thinnest layers of ice, a crack in the shape of the left anterior artery flourishing like film. Where the lightning struck her, I developed a mark on my shoulder. I became polished metal, a conductor of electricity, a living mirror who could reminisce about that spectacular strike.
Oh, wow. what a wonderful set of poems. It was like you were trading spells, like casting spells back and forth. And I am in awe of the language that is by turns beautiful and terrifying that we heard tonight. So thank you so much for those excellent poems. We do have time for a question and answer right now. So if our audience members would like to drop questions into the chat or the Q&A, now would be a great time to do it. We do already have a pair of questions, one for David and one for Amy, from Jacqueline DeForge. So first to David, how did the process of writing your new collection compare to writing your first?
In some ways, easier and harder. Second collections are not any easier than the first. The problem that I kind of put myself in and had to navigate with this one was that what's called Dream of Me is water. So, right away, it's gonna be a lot of water in the book. And I really put myself in a box like, oh crap, this is a lot of water I'm writing about. So I had to find really creative ways to use it as a metaphor and refer to water without actually referring to water itself. So there's a lot of, sea creatures in it and other things that I hope that are unexpected. Like I go to space a lot in some of the poems. In terms of like just craft and theme, craft in that I really want to play on the page a lot more, as opposed to Mythical Man, where the poems are really kind of structured. For the most part, most of them are. With Dream of Me as water, because the theme is water, I wanted the poems to kind of flow on the page more. So there's a lot more breaking out of really confines that I put myself in with Mythical Man. So there's gonna be a lot more of that, a lot of wavy poems and words that are kind of all over the place. And it was just really refreshing writing the second collection as well, because Mythical Man I find now looking back on it and doing the readings, but a lot of the poems are really heavy, and that they're just about like racism and like homophobia and all that stuff. And it's just a lot of heavy stuff that I don't really want to talk about this stuff anymore, because it's so tiring reading poems about that all the time. And I found that like a lot of people reading Mythical Man, which I'm grateful for, a lot of the times people were picking out themes and kind of similarities in poems were like the references to race and gayness. And while there are, I just thought there was a lot more Mythical Man than that. So with Dream of Me as water, it's going to be a bit different in that I'm kind of trying to break that. And being a writer of color, do I have to write about being a writer of color all the time? No, I don't, because I don't want to. So Dream of Me as water is kind of refreshing in that sense, that I got to really write about whatever I wanted and not be like prescribed to anybody's reading list and whatnot. So it was kind of a collection that's more for my sake and my personal enjoyment of like just being imaginative through poetry and all that. So thanks for the question, Jacqueline.
Yeah, great question and great answer. Thanks, David. Now to Amy from Jacqueline. I love the way your poems tell stories. As a fiction writer as well, what are your thoughts on creating story through poetry versus prose?
Thanks for that question, Jacqueline. I always appreciate getting this question because it's something that's really on my mind a lot as I'm writing. Because I do, like you said, write both fiction and poetry. And for me, what I find kind of occupying both of those genres is that a lot of the times they intersect in ways that I don't necessarily expect them to. Like what I have sometimes is I sit down to write a short story and it turns out it actually wants to be a poem. And sometimes the opposite is true. And sometimes I end up with pieces where it's kind of half poetry, half prose. That's kind of my most comfortable mode these days, is working in something that's kind of right in the middle of those two as we know them. And I think when it comes down to, for me, because you asked what are your thoughts on creating story, and I think what I find is most important in any kind of writing is telling a story. And poetry can tell stories as much as prose can. That was something that it took me a long time to learn, because I just wasn't encountering a lot of the poetry that I was kind of taught in my formal schooling wasn't really the storytelling kind of poetry. It was very much of like quintessential can-lit poetry about place and about these very important themes, but not so much about telling a really fascinating story. And then something that I kind of discovered was, first off, that I really love listening to podcasts. And second of all, that I really like writing back to podcasts, and like listening to a story and then kind of finding a different way to tell it in my own words, and to kind of create a poem out of something that's really purely nonfiction. So I guess all of this to kind of say that for me, at this point in my writing life, the boundaries are pretty blurred, even when sometimes I want them to be a bit firmer. I'm having a hard time kind of keeping them apart all the time. But fundamentally for me, story is always the most important, and just telling that story in the most compelling and effective way. Not to say that I always do that properly, but I'm working on it. But yeah, thank you so much for your question. It's an important one for me, because I do think about it quite a lot. So thanks, Jacqueline.
And another great answer. Thanks so much, Amy. And thanks to Jacqueline for both of your questions. If anyone else in the audience would like to ask a question, we've still got time. So please do drop your questions into the Q&A section or into the chat. In the meantime, I'd like to talk to both of you briefly about, I think, what is one of the strongest features of both of your books, which is imagery. Just really sensory, sensual imagery that really lingers in the imagination. Maybe I'll start with David. In Mythical Man, I see that there are sort of two sides in some ways to the imagery, in the sense that you write poems that are very evocative of cityscapes, public transit, public areas, really sort of relatable everyday things. But then you also have the other side of the coin with, for instance, the Mythical Man poems, and poems like Hunt and Boy in your collection that are, it's almost like becoming immersed in this fantasy world. It's very, it feels very mythic. And so I was wondering how you see that relationship between perhaps the personal or the everyday blurring with the mythical dimensions of your work, because you write very evocatively about both.
Thank you for noticing that about my writing. It's something that I actually didn't notice about my book until people started telling me that I write about those two kind of I don't know, two different kind of places, the city and the urban landscape, and this kind of made up fantasy world. And I think the easier answer for the whole city and urban references is because a lot of the poems that I wrote for Mythical Man were ones that I wrote like just on transit. I used to live a lot further from work, and to kill the time between the hour and a half to and from work, like twice a day, I would write poems. And I think that they just kind of like being on the SkyTrain just really made its way into my poems. And I wrote like a bunch of poems about, you know, transit and being on the street. So I think that in that sense, those poems speak to kind of like just where I physically am, where I physically was a lot of times when writing Mythical Man. But also, you know, the other poems stem from, you know, this weird imagination that I've had ever since growing up. And I think maybe now Mythical Man, I'm starting to see it now, the way you kind of asked the question, is there two kind of facets of who I am, where I am physically, but also where I am a lot of the time in my own head. So I think that's where that comes from. And that it's just me kind of indulging that little kid in me who just likes to imagine things and see things in my mind. Like I remember growing up and still these days, like I have a very strangely, and I think it's a writer thing, but a very vivid imagination. Like I see things very clearly, and sometimes it's kind of scary, so I have to write them out. But yeah, so it's interesting to see those two kind of worlds mix and mingle together in Mythical Man. And in a sense, yeah, they create this kind of mythic setting where the fantastical kind of meets the very urban and real SkyTrain settings and all that, which I'm very curious. Now I'm thinking about how the next book's gonna look, because I didn't write a lot of it on transit. So a lot of it was done on my couch during COVID. So we'll see what happens there. But thanks for picking that up about Mythical Man.
Yeah, and I was actually really glad that you read Mythical Man too, which is one of my favorite poems in the collection, simply because I think that it blends those two worlds together so nicely. in the sense that it feels almost like a poem that's processing a toxic relationship through the mythological image of the Hydra.
Yeah.
And I love how that sort of unites those two sides of your work. Thanks so much for.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you for noticing that poem. That one was fun to write. The Hydra kind of just made its way into that poem because I don't know. I'm really thinking about what can these two men become, or their dreams become, that's so like scary, but so like repetitive and something that you can't really extinguish a lot. And it made me think about one of my favorite movies, Jason and the Argonauts, that really old movie, and the Golden Fleece. And there's a Hydra in it, right? And so like it was really fun for me to put that into the poem. And yeah.
Some stop motion poems.
Yeah, I love that movie so much.
Oh, it's a classic. Now, Amy, I just wanted to ask you a bit about your imagery as well, because it's so deeply rooted in myth and folklore and fairy tales. And there's actually a wonderful interview that we were talking about before, in which David interviews you about a lot of those elements of your book in Prism International. And I'd encourage our audience members to check that out because it's a really excellent interview. But what I find interesting about your poems is that with those fairy tale elements, to me, it feels like many of the speakers are, they're going through a form of transformation. And to me, sometimes this feels like a form of escape, sometimes as a way of self-protection, but also sometimes these transformations in the fairy tale language are traps. And I mean, one of my favorite images was from The Girl Who Turns to Bone. Like clotted cream, she thickens through cartilage and persiflage until she turns to stone. So I was wondering if you might be able to talk about that transformative element of your imagery. I was really glad that you read Birthing Black Rabbits, which is one of my favorites. And I love how that poem actually pairs with the poem Rosa, where one is sort of about birth and one is sort of about butchery and death. And it seems like those are two poles that operate in the poems of I know something you don't know. Sorry, that was sort of a long-winded way of saying it, but transformation, I wonder if you might be able to talk about that in terms of the fairy tale elements of your poetry.
Absolutely. And thank you for telling me about your favorite pieces. I'm always so happy. If anybody has a favorite, that's always the best thing, that it meant something. I appreciate too that you picked up on that kind of transformation trap kind of dichotomy, because it is there, and that a lot of the speakers are either kind of emerging into something new or kind of settling back into an old form, or kind of both at different times. And part of that for me does just kind of go back to like the classic fairy tales, which I've always loved. And like David, like you mentioned, having like a weirdly vivid imagination, I have the same thing. And I think it helps us as writers. It freaks me out sometimes, because with the vividness, I always say that like once things go in visually, they don't come out. I just can't unsee them. So I really struggled a lot growing up with like how to engage with things that kind of scared me. But at the same time, I wanted to kind of for that little bit of adrenaline and that thrill. And I did find some of that in like classic fairy tales, where they're interesting and they're allegorical, and they're also very, very dark. They're much darker than the Disney versions that we get to see as kids. And in a lot of those fairy tales, there's kind of tropes. The more that you read them, you start to notice things occurring more and more often. And one of those is always transformation. In that there's always something that's transforming into a different form, or that's just kind of switching clothes, or that's, like you mentioned, a trap, like somebody hiding in a disguise or something. And I think I find those kind of ideas really interesting as devices for poetry, because I think fundamentally poetry is about transformation, and it's about transforming individual words into entire pieces, and transforming perceptions for a reader, and that hopefully you leave them slightly different, hopefully better, after having read your work. So for me, that kind of transformation, I wanted that to work on so many different levels. And then I wanted it to work on the level of the reader and on the level of the word and on the level of the story that I was engaging with first off. So I'm happy to hear that kind of came through really strongly. And then that was something that you picked up on. And like you mentioned, birthing black rabbits and Rosa. I'd been planning to read Rosa tonight and then didn't manage to fit it in. But those are my two kind of rabbit poems within the collection, and they're placed pretty close together. And like you said, one is about the birth of the rabbits, and then one is about the butchering of the rabbits, which made for interesting research because I have personally never butchered a rabbit. But I really enjoy playing with having poems like that on kind of different ends of the spectrum and with placing them close together in a collection, so that you can kind of make those bigger connections. Yeah, that's my long-winded answer. I hope that answers your question a little bit.
Well, that was great, yes. And I imagine that once you see the research of a rabbit being butchered, that's something you don't unsee.
You don't unsee it, it's true. My search history was a little questionable. I mean, it always is, but.
Oh, thank you. That was a great answer. We have just 8 minutes left. So if there are any last minute questions, feel free to drop them into the Q&A or the chat. One thing that I want to draw to everyone's attention is that tomorrow evening, same time, 7:30 p.m. Eastern time, 4:30 p.m. Pacific time, David Ly will be leading an imagery workshop. So there's still some seats available. If you'd like to sign up for that, the link has been dropped into the chat. I don't see another question, so I actually have one more question for both of you, which is about structure. Poetry, I think, Amy, you said very nicely that it's about transformation, and I think in some ways seeing things, seeing clearly and seeing how they change. And I think the visual dimension of the structure of poems is another important aspect, and it's something that both of you do a lot with in your collections. So in particular, I was thinking of, Amy, your poem, Tarantella, which dances across the page and has a very sort of punchy two-syllable foot feel to the rhythm that really feels like the poem is dancing. And then David, I really loved your social media poems, Post 1 and Post 2, which do an excellent job, and I'm not sure if our audience can see these poems, of sort of replicating the various realities that are presented in social media posts, from the sort of raw image that's then filtered to perfection and then posted and liked. Both of those poems, I think, exemplify the sort of experimentation and structure, or the variety of structure that you have in your books. And I was wondering if you could talk about that briefly. How do you approach structuring a poem so then it has its own visual identity on the page and maybe suits the content of the poem in a way that makes sense to you as poets?
You want to start, David, or?
I'm trying to think about it, because this is a topic that still intimidates me about poetry in general, because like truthfully, I don't know what structure does to a poem onto a page. All I know is that like, for instance, the social media poem you picked up, David, I had a structure like that because, yes, I wanted to make it look like an Instagram post. So in that sense, it really just varies from the poem that I'm writing. If I want to reflect something, then I'll just do it in that shape. But really, like, I'm still experimenting with form, and I'm doing a lot of stealing of other people's form that I see that people are doing in books. I'm like, oh, that's kind of neat. And I try to mimic that. And then I remember that, oh, they probably saw it from somewhere and they thought it was cool too. So yeah, but like I said, in the new book, there's more poems that kind of, swirl on the page. Like, for instance, that poem you guys didn't see a lot today because when I was reading it, Eels, it's, fittingly so, it's shaped like an eel, that it kind of swirls down the page. And for me, that's because I have such a kind of I still feel like nowadays a very like developing understanding of poetry. For me, the easiest thing to think about when it comes to structure is if there's like an easy correlation between what the poem is talking about and if it reflects that on the page. Sometimes if it's just like kind of like lines are kind of like jaggedy on the page, sometimes I just want to do that because like it's a different way to kind of like tell a story or a narrative, because in poetry, what you can do in poetry, not prose, I find is line breaks, right? And how you break a line, it changes the way the line is read and what it can mean following the line after it. So breaking the line in sort of jagged ways kind of twists the narrative in a way that's a bit surprising for myself. And yeah, it just changes the way a story that can be told, I think, visually. I think, but yeah, I'll get back to that answer because I don't really know what form does to a poem other than what my half attempt of an answer just tried to do there. I think Amy has a better idea what shape a poem does.
I'm not sure. I totally relate with what you were saying about like still experimenting, and that's why like I hardly feel qualified to even have an opinion on this, because it's just I'm still working on it. I'm still learning, and I feel like every time I read somebody's poetry collection, I learn something new. The same kind of way where you see something and you want to emulate it. What I will say is that my first inclination with a piece is usually to just do like left side margins, normal indentation, and then kind of take it from there. And then every now and then there's a piece that just needs to be different. So like David, you'd mentioned Tarantella, and with that piece, the kind of backstory on that one was about this really weird topic. It's one of my favorite things to talk about, but the dancing plague of 1518. There's a couple different podcasts about it. But basically it was this really wild time. It was this little town in France, and a couple people started kind of dancing in the town square and they couldn't stop. And then it became this giant party and they had bands and everything. And then people realized that they actually could not stop. They were like dancing themselves to death. Their hearts were stopping. And there's a lot of different theories about what happened here. One of the biggest ones is that like the baker might have had like flour that had gone fungal and they were all actually having seizures. Another one was that they'd all been bitten by spiders. So the really interesting part, it's a long story to get there, but tarantella as like the music form actually came from this because they thought they'd been bitten by tarantulas. So with that piece in particular, it was just one where it was like, this can't be a left-sided margined piece. This has to be something that moves the way that I want the sound to move. And I'll be completely honest, that's a poem that I have a really hard time reading out loud because I have a hard time making my mouth form the actual sounds as quickly as they need to be on the page. So maybe that's a fault with how I wrote the poem, but that's my confession for that one. But I guess all of that to kind of say that sometimes the structure just kind of comes to you for a poem. And I feel like that's for me when it's best, because I could make a poem into a certain structure and kind of force that onto it. Or sometimes the structure just kind of comes from within it. And that's when it really kind of feels genuine. And I find that I can see that sometimes with other people's pieces where it's like, this is the only way that I can fathom seeing this poem structured. And sometimes it's just like a magical kind of reading experience. But yeah, still experimenting, still figuring it all out. Yeah.
Great answers. And yeah, that was some excellent historical context. Very, very illuminating. We have one more question in the Q&A from Cassie Zimmerman, who asks, to Amy, what is your process when selecting and retelling a story as a poem?
That's a great question. Thank you for that. It's kind of a gut feeling more than anything, which I know is kind of a sucky answer. But it's kind of that experience where you encounter a story and something about it just hooks you. And you kind of feel it like in your body. You get that excitement that comes with hearing something really interesting. And then when I'm looking at something, I always kind of try to look at the potential, like if I'm looking at a fairy tale, for example, of like the potential for different kinds of imagery and the potential for reversal, kind of going back to that transformation topic we were talking about earlier, but just looking at like, what could I do with this piece to still keep it true and recognizable to what it was in the first place, but also to kind of put my own creative spin on it and to make it mine at the same time. So it is kind of a gut feeling thing. There's pieces that I just don't have that feeling for, and I just know that that's not going to translate into a great poem. So it is just kind of piece by piece, figuring it out as like an instinct kind of thing.
That's a great answer as well. And I guess interesting to see that intersection of research and the personal, and how at a certain point they intermingle and become something new entirely. Excellent. Well, I think that's all the questions that we've got. Those were very generous answers, very illuminating answers that I think all of us really appreciate. Two quick notes. First of all, Mythical Man by David Ly. The purchase link is going to be dropped into the chat again in just a moment. And I Know Something You Don't Know by Amy LeBlanc. Definitely check out both of these books. They are all killer, no filler. So they're definitely worthwhile to read. Also, David Ly's workshop will be happening tomorrow again, 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time, 4:30 p.m. Pacific Time. Please join if you can. The link is in the chat again. And lastly, I just want to thank Amy and David for such a fantastic evening of poetry. It was so wonderful to hear your words, and as Josh said in the chat, your transitions were amazing. It was like a seamless concert, just absolutely beautiful. So thank you so much again, and I suppose good night to everyone. So thanks so much. Take care, and check out David's workshop tomorrow evening. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for coming, everyone.